Big recruiting weekend this past weekend on campus at the University of Nebraska, hosting their Junior Day festivities. A lot of really good talent visiting the land of the Huskers. 5 stars, 4 stars, but there was one guy I think that everybody had their eye on, Dylan Raiola. What would it mean if Nebraska could land a Dylan Raiola commitment? Before we get into that, just a reminder to hit subscribe if you haven't already. Big Ten content all offseason long. Always crush that like button to spread the word of Big Ten Ted to the masses. I'm going to start with some quotes from Dylan Raiola himself. Quote, Coach Rule is always texting me that it only takes one. We'll come back to that. Also, really envisioning myself trying to change a program is pretty special. Having them think of me like that to be a culture changer. It's a consistent message every time I talk to them. And it's not only a consistent message when they talk to a recruit like Dylan Raiola. This is a consistent message that Matt Rule is trying to hit home. Every time he talks to the media, every time he makes a public appearance, this is a culture change going on at the University of Nebraska. There is absolutely no question about that. Now, what would a commitment by the number one player in the country? Isn't it crazy right now that we're mentioning Nebraska in terms of recruiting? We're mentioning Nebraska in the same breath, in the same recruiting battles as Kirby Smart in Georgia, Lincoln Riley and USC for a top player like this? It's pretty crazy, but that's what Matt Rule has been able to. He's able to finagle those Nebraska connections, those Raiola family connections into a pretty hot recruiting battle right now with USC and Georgia. What would it mean? Let's start first because it would mean big things for Nebraska and the Big Ten. Let's start first what it would mean for Nebraska. It would turn a lot of heads. I think for a lot of people, when they're in a recruiting battle, remember he decommitted from Ohio State earlier. Not saying he couldn't go back to Ohio State, but right now it appears Nebraska's in a recruiting battle with Dylan Raiola, with USC, with Georgia, and Ohio State. If Nebraska can come out on top out of those 3 schools, that's going to turn a lot of heads, and it's going to bring a lot of attention to Nebraska. And with that, you're going to see the floodgates open. Okay, if you get a Dylan Raiola commitment, especially before his senior year down in Arizona, you're going to see a lot of other high school players pique their interest. They're going to start thinking about Nebraska. Maybe not players that are visiting right now, but maybe other players throughout the country at some position needs. Matt Rule might be able to go out and get, and he might draw a lot of interest because Dylan Raiola is the kind of player when he commits to a school that's maybe not a Bama, a Georgia, an Ohio State, a Michigan, a Clemson, if he doesn't commit to a school like that, he kind of goes against the grain and goes to a school like Nebraska that's in the midst of a culture change. That's going to turn a lot of heads nationwide. That's going to turn a lot of heads in the recruiting business, not only for players, but other people who cover recruiting as well. They're going to start to think of Nebraska as a possible recruiting threat. And I will get to this a little bit later in the video, but no one in the Big Ten wants that. They're used to Nebraska maybe staying down a little bit as well. This would be because when we look at Nebraska, this is a program that's been down. And look, recruiting-wise, they've recruited fairly well. Right under Scott Frost, this was a team that consistently top 25 to top 35 classes nationally, top 4 to top 6 classes in the Big Ten. Now, a lot of those players eventually ended up entering the transfer portal, but recruiting has never really been a problem per se at Nebraska. But now if they're able to raise the recruiting even more, the floodgates are going to open, and a lot of other Big Ten schools are going to look around and say, oh boy, Nebraska is here on the recruiting side, and that could be dangerous. I will get to that here a little bit later in the video. Let's talk about it from a Big Ten perspective, because I've seen this a lot on Twitter. I've seen this a lot on YouTube. Right? Nebraska has the resources. Nebraska has the fan base. Nebraska has the interest. And they have all of this despite winning 3 and 4 games, a combined 7 games the last 2 seasons. What happens when Nebraska's good? What happens when Nebraska's even winning 7 games and winning 8 games? They're drawing interest from the number 1 player in the country. Now, of course, there's that family connection, but they're drawing interest from the number 1 player in the country, but that's not it. There, like I said at the beginning of the video, there's a lot of 5 stars. There's a lot of 4 stars on campus. You look at Ryan Mingo, who's a wide receiver that's drawing interest out of the St. Louis area, the number 5 receiver in this class. He visited Nebraska during junior day. He says he wants to take another visit to Nebraska, so that's a target that the Huskers are focusing in on. Like, this is all, now I know there's a new coaching staff, there's a lot of, they're rejuvenated a little bit, but Nebraska's coming off 3 and 4 win seasons, and they're still in the hunt. What happens when the Huskers are even winning 7, 8, and 9 games every season? Where does their recruiting go from there? What type of talent acquisition are they able to bring in at that level compared to what they've been bringing in? Because they've had a decent amount of talent. They just haven't been able to capitalize it. You know, they frosted themselves, so to speak. So when we look at this from a Big Ten perspective, okay, this provides now, if you're able to get Dylan Raiola, and with that the floodgates open, more talent comes into UNL. If that happens, that allows Nebraska to possibly be an 8-win team. That allows Nebraska to be a 9 and maybe even a 10-win program, and that's good for television. That's good for Fox. That's good for CBS. That's good for NBC, because Nebraska is a brand that nobody is really indifferent about. You might love them, you might like them, you might hate them, you might think they suck, but you got an opinion about Nebraska. Okay, even when they're losing 3 games, even when they're losing 4 games, this is a program that still draws attention nationally. Now, it might have not been the best attention the last couple of years, but it's still attention. But if they can draw good attention, and this is a consistently good team, it just adds to the depths of the Big Ten. Said it before, I'm going to elaborate on it. A lot of teams, I think, in the Big Ten are looking at Nebraska and saying, well, it's kind of good that they're down because they got a lot more resources than we do. Okay, I'm not going to mention any names right now because people might get a little bit riffed by it, but there's some programs in the Big Ten Conference that have risen up the last couple of years that don't have the resources that Nebraska does, that maybe aren't investing in NIL or don't have quite the NIL collectives and boosters that Nebraska does. And as long as Nebraska's winning 3, 4, and 5 games a year, they're feeling pretty good. But if Nebraska is able to bring in a talent like Dylan Raiola, a talent like Ryan Wingo, they had the number 1 offensive tackle in the country also visit during this junior day. If they're able to bring in that type of talent and they rise up, that's bad news for some of those teams in the middle right now that are able to rise up these last few years, get 8, 9, 10 wins, because if you have Nebraska recruit and bring in that type of talent every single year, this could be a consistent 8 to 10 win team. I firmly believe that Matt Rule is probably going to turn them in somewhere to a 7 to 9 win team per season. But now if you're able to get 5 stars and a lot of 4 stars into Lincoln, that could change very quickly. It's going to be good for big-time matchups on television because of the interest and because of the fan base that Nebraska brings. But there's other parts and other teams in the Big Ten that say, well, a Nebraska team that rises up might not be so good for us. Dylan Raiola could be the piece to really push Nebraska to the next level. Now, although maybe it's not super likely that they bring in a lot of these guys, for Nebraska to be in the same breath in a recruiting battle as a Kirby Smart in Georgia, as a Ryan Day in Ohio State, all these guys, for a top player like this, like a Dylan Raiola and some of these other players, that's a big early win for Matt Rule and the Nebraska Cornhuskers. I want to hear what you guys think. What do you think would happen? What do you think we would see if Dylan Raiola commits to Nebraska? Would the floodgates open, or would it just be a flash in the pan? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I'm Big Ten Ted. We will see you in the next one.